Okay, I'm going to go ahead and kick off with the background. Welcome all of you to the Puget Sound Kelp Research and Monitoring Work Group, the January meeting. And just as a little bit of background before we get started, this work group is a pilot work group, and it was identified as a need in the Kelp plan that it would be good to have a research and monitoring work group to increase collaboration and information sharing. And it's a 2-year pilot. So at the end of 2022, we will decide if we should continue a group like this and what it should look like. So that's a great thing for us all to think about in the meantime. And in the chat, please introduce yourself, provide any updates you want to provide, and request any topics that you'd like to hear from us. And we will use those in future workshops. So on that note, we've got a really full and exciting agenda today. So I'm just going to keep moving and start with the agenda at exactly 10, which is great. So you should all see a slide with today's agenda, which you also received in the by email. We'll have a round of updates and then talks by Bob Keel and Jeff Whitty. And then the second half of the meeting is devoted to a really great topic, which is transboundary connections. And so we have a lot of our colleagues from the Northern Salish Sea and Outer Coast who will be helping us to discuss that. And it's really exciting. We already have 2 logos for an International Kelp Alliance. And so we're hoping to put those logos to good use. I'm going to jump into the first brief update, which is that some of you may have already heard that we're adding a floating kelp canopy area indicator to the Puget Sound vital signs. And we won't talk a lot about that in this meeting. Anyone who wants to hear more, I want to give you some ways that you can hear more. First of all, the little tiny bit of background, there's a real diversity emphasis to this indicator because we believe that broad participation will both enrich the indicator and also strengthen its connection to conservation and restoration. And that has been shown to bear out in the literature, which is if you're more connected, you're more likely to succeed at conservation. We have 6 different project partners that you can see by their logos. And here's a quick timeline for the project. The project started January 1st, and it runs from 2022 till May 2023. And there are 3 different phases to that project. The first one, which is what we're in right now, is to scope the indicator. And that'll go through the end of March. Then we're going to start exploring different indicator options, which means visualization and working with real data and doing visualizations and then showing all of you visualizations in the summertime period. And then finally, for the second half of 2022 and for 2023, we will select a final indicator, refine it, and post it to Puget Sound info. So we're at the very beginning. We just kicked off the project and we just released a report yesterday. And we're having a big workshop tomorrow. And I'll talk very briefly about those things. Here's a copy of the report, a little picture of it. I will put a link to the report in the chat so all of you can take a look at it. The report asks, and the workshop will really ask a series of questions. I'm going to go over these very briefly here. And you can just glance at the report to see them. This is what we want to know from you. And we could get your input at the workshop. We could get your input at other discussions. We're happy to have small meetings, or you can just email us. So the type of questions we're asking are, what is the indicator for and how will it be used? And in a nutshell, we think it needs to be for diverse audiences, and we need a simple figure, but then also some detailed metrics for people who want to drill down. The second big question is that the indicator is limited to describing status and trends in kelp canopies. So what linkages are most important? And we've outlined that stressors, management actions, ecosystem components, and human well-being are the big components that we need to make sure to consider. Another big question is what time span should the indicator consider and why? What geographic assessment areas are important and why? And what data should be included in the initial indicator and then the future indicator? So I'm not going to say a whole lot more, but what we tried to do, we really want to hear from you, but we also wanted to share our initial thoughts, and you can find this exact table in the executive summary of the report. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. That's a quick summary of the new Puget Sound floating kelp area indicator. Send me any emails or in chats, and I can answer any specific questions.
Okay.
And now I'm also going to pass it over to Elizabeth, who's going to MC the rest of the presentations.
Excellent. Thank you, Helen. All right, everyone, we are going to move through our presentations. As Helen mentioned, we have a few updates before we do so. So Ron, I'm going to hand it to you. Ron Tom's going to speak to us about the net ecological gain study.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can get my screen. Is it working there?
Yep, you might want to pop it into presentation mode, but it looks good so far.
All right. Yeah, this is I appreciate being asked to do this. The State Academy of Sciences has been asked to look at the topic of net ecological gain. And this is just a few slides about what's going on with that. The Academy is a nonprofit. It was initiated in 2007 by Governor Gregoire, and it's there to, the mission is to provide science to the state. And there's about 330 members. About half are National Academy members and the other half are elected. The sponsor of this is State Fish, and they came to us to help them with this project. And the contacts are below Jeff and Marvin. The objective is to advise the state legislature on net ecological gain standards for the state land use, development, and environmental laws to achieve a goal of better statewide performance and ecological health and endangered species recovery, including the recovery of salmon. That's the broad objective. So the committee is going to be looking at, or is tasked to define net ecological gain, the goals, the objectives, the metrics, and a standard, assess how efficient the existing standards have been for achieving endangered species recovery, such as no net loss, recommending indicators and monitoring for no net loss and net ecological gain, and conducting a scientific review of a much larger report to the legislature that WDFW will put together. So here's the timeline. It is definitely a quick one. We're having another meeting of the panel on Friday, and we're just coming up with the ideas of a definition and goals and metrics. Then we move on to no net loss and recommended indicators, on and on, and then review the report. So it's pretty crunched. It got started late for a number of reasons. Let's see, next slide. Why won't this go? Yeah, so the committee members, I'm the chair, and Heather does what's called how buildings give back to the ecosystem services. Ken Kearns is a fisheries biologist with works on endangered species recovery. Haida is a watershed and coastal science researcher and has done a lot in cumulative effects of restoration projects. And she just got off of a National Academy's panel on that for the Gulf of Mexico. Tim is a systems ecologist and quantitative application to conservation of fisheries. And Arnie is a watersheds person and does ecological engineering work and equity work. Mary Ruckelshaus, many of you may know her. She's in charge of the Natural capital project, and she works on climate assessments and environmental services. And Trina Wellman is a natural resource economist that's been around Puget Sound for a long, long time. And we have a great staff that is really helping out. This is just one example, and this is something I was involved in along with UW and State Fish and the Corps of Engineers and NOAA and EPA in the 90s, and that was the rebuild of the Clinton Ferry Terminal. And what the two issues were is they needed to get a full boatload of cars past the toll booth because the ships run very frequently. So they were going to build a much wider dock, and we said, well, maybe you could build it longer and less wide, and they thought they could do that, and maybe you can do something about the prop scour that comes from the vessels, which they did by reorienting them to put out the scour alongshore instead of toward the Eeelgrass. And this took about 2 years of research to figure out. And then they had predicted that about 3,000 square meters of Eeelgrass was going to be lost. And by the redesign and by stockpiling Eeelgrass that was going to be lost and planting it and growing it up 2 years for 2 years at the Marine Sciences Lab in Sequim to make more, and planting it out. And you can see the plots where it was planted here in the brown and the lighter color. And before the dock was constructed, there was Eeelgrass already growing. And it ended up with the design of only 300 square meters of Eeelgrass was directly lost. And overall, there was a 2.3-fold gain in the total Eeelgrass shoot abundance based on the project. So that's been published in a couple places. And we think that's an example of net ecological gain. And we also advise using glass blocks in the walkway. So this was finished, I think, in early 2000s. So it's been around for a while. There's others out there too that we could talk about. So here's some definitions that have been around for a while. No net loss, most of us know about it. And it's turned out the National Academies looked at it in 2001, and it really wasn't working at all. And I don't think it's been well documented in the state here how it's worked. And my sense from talking with people is it really hasn't been assessed. Net gain has been, EPA started looking into it in 2004. England has net ecological gain rules that they operate by for both public and private lands. And the state of Washington is providing funding from the legislature to develop this report. Net ecosystem improvement is what we termed what happened at Clinton. And it's essentially net ecological gain. And then the latest document I read was from Ecology, net ecological benefit, and the outcome of a plan to yield offsets that exceed impacts within a planning horizon and the relevant WIRA boundary. That was their definition. So that gives you an idea of what we've got out there to work with. Also, additional considerations are best available science, communication of uncertainty, scale, how this operates, climate change impacts, and other things like that. So we're asking for comments. The Academy, you can go to their website, which is the Washington State Academy of Sciences. Don't go to Washington Academy of Science, you'll get someplace else in the country. Or you can contact Yasmin there. And so that's it. If anybody has any questions, there will be a public meeting, I believe, scheduled for later this month. I think it's the 24th of January. So you could tune into that. There'll be more information there.
Thank you.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Right. And as we move between speakers, I do want to encourage anyone, if you do have questions or comments, we don't have a lot of time in between our updates today to take those, but please do feel free to throw those in the chat. You can chat our presenters directly, you can send them to the group, and we will try to integrate those into our discussion later on in the meeting today. Okay, so next we have Max Lambert from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he's going to be talking about a report he just recently finished on small overwater structures and the review of effects on Puget Sound habitat and salmon. So Max, take it away.
Thanks very much. I just put the link to that report in the chat for everyone to look at if they want to. I won't take much time, but largely DFW is tasked with putting together a literature review on the impacts of smaller overwater structures. So Ron just showed a nice study on large structures like ferry terminals, but we were looking at any evidence there was out there for things like residential, small docks, mooring buoys, things like that, largely through their impacts of shade. And Tom Mumford was part of this project as well. Surprisingly, there actually wasn't that much literature out there to review at this point in time. It seems like a pretty understudied aspect of the nearshore environment, not only in Puget Sound, but across the country and even around the world. Probably the best take-home message we have at this point in time is it's pretty solid evidence that things like eelgrass and other seagrasses are heavily impacted even from small overwater structures from shading. And that's pretty consistent evidence for a whole variety of studies. Beyond that, for other forms of SAV, kelp in general is just completely understudied. There's a little bit of work on sugar kelp, but it gives pretty inconsistent results. Some studies showing complete loss, some showing complete gain of sugar kelp in some of these places. But beyond that, there's not a whole lot of other work on kelp, which is pretty interesting and pretty important need, we think. With the large overwater structure literature that does exist, there has been pretty heavy concern and some good evidence that the shadow line cast by those structures can halt or impede salmon migration. And there's a little bit of work from a single doc by Jason Toft's group that shows that may also be the case with smaller structures. But beyond that, there's really no fish data from these private docks. And we think this is actually pretty interesting, given that there are over 6,000 of these smaller docks and many more thousands of other forms of small water structures across Puget Sound. And there's very little data on that. So from our angle, we're kind of actively seeking partners to do studies on these smaller water structures for a whole variety of possible impacts through shade or whatever else that could be out there, because it is so understudied, and we're encouraging folks to kind of take that on themselves as well. So that's really all I wanted to kind of highlight for this literature review, making sure folks knew this is out there, and hopefully to entice others to get in the game on this too and study this, given how common these things are. I'm happy to answer questions via email or in the chat too. So thanks all.
Thanks, Max. All right, now we're going to move to Tyler Cowdery, Department of Natural Resources. He's going to speak about the demonstration project with the Northwest Straits Commission on drone aircraft surveys at MRC volunteer kayak monitoring sites. Tyler, it's all you.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. Let's get this share up. Okay, hopefully you can see that now.
Looks good.
Great, thanks. So yeah, today I'll be presenting on a remote sensing project we just finished up at the end of 2021. This project investigated the use of UAV and manned fixed-wing aircraft imagery to map floating kelp forest canopies at Northwest Straits Marine Resources Committee volunteer monitoring sites in northern Puget Sound. The use of remote sensing technology to monitor kelp forests is something DNR has been interested in for a very long time. The Washington Coastal Kelp Inventory, for example, has been flying surveys in the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the outer coast since 1989. DNR has also been testing the use of drones in this context since about 2016. However, this was kind of the first major project where we compared both methods to each other and to boat-based surveys directly. Just in terms of broad motivations for the project, the strategic goal number 3 of the 2020 Kelp Plan was to describe kelp distribution and trends throughout Puget Sound. Despite many great ongoing research and monitoring efforts, there are still data gaps that need to be filled in order to achieve sound-wide coverage. So out of that motivation, an interagency agreement was signed between the Northwest Straits Commission and DNR in 2021 to investigate how remote sensing platforms compare to boat-based monitoring methods. and could potentially complement them in the future. There were two primary platforms chosen for this project. Our UAV platform was the DJI Phantom 4 multispectral drone, which captures imagery in 5 bands, including red edge and near infrared. And our fixed wing platform was a Mapper Survey 3W NGB camera, which captures imagery in near infrared, green, and blue. This camera was affixed to the underside of the wing of a Cessna airplane, which was operated by the volunteer pilot, Greg Ritter. In total, we attempted 17 surveys at MRC volunteer monitoring sites in northern Puget Sound, which you can see in the map on the left. These were conducted from early July to late September of 2021. 6 of these were UAV surveys, 11 were fixed wing. Of these, 14 were successful, 8 were processed into complete orthomosaics, which is a fancy term for stitching all the imagery into one continuous image. And 4 of those were then selected for detailed analysis and comparison to UAV, to fixed wing at Edmonds and North Beach. So our first main finding from this project was identifying the central trade-off between these two platforms, which was spatial resolution of the imagery versus the aerial coverage possible within a survey window. In the example here, we can see the North Beach kelp monitoring site highlighted in yellow. The UAV survey of that area took approximately an hour to complete, while the entire 7-kilometer stretch of coast you can see in the bottom survey captured by a fixed wing platform took only about 10 minutes to survey. So this indicates that the fixed wing platform is more suitable for large scale monitoring. Conversely, on the right, we can see the difference in image resolution between the two products. Here, the UAV is clearly better suited when detailed analysis at the individual site scale is desired. So you can see how individual plants are discernible in the UAV imagery. The first way we compared the imagery to kayak-based surveys was to hand delineate kelp forest perimeter at each orthomosaic. You can see some examples of that here. This was done using the same 8-meter inclusion threshold that is used by Northwest Straits volunteer kayakers. Overall, we found that both methods showed general agreement as to location and distribution of each kelp bed. However, calculating areas from these perimeters resulted in variable estimates, sometimes differing by as much as a factor of 2. We also analyzed these orthomosaics using a method known as object-based supervised image classification, which designates a class for each pixel based on its spectral properties and those of pixels around it. The classifier we chose for this project was a random forest model. Overall, we found that the classifier was very accurate in differentiating kelp from the surrounding environment in open water areas. However, it performed worse in the shallow subtidal zone, ranging from about 5 to 40 meters offshore, depending on site, where other algae and bottom vegetation was present. It was also found that the difference in pixel size between the two platforms resulted in classified kelp canopy maps that looked quite different. So there are 2 examples of that here. The UAV imagery was, again, able to clearly pick out individual plants, while fixed wing imagery more often grouped multiple individuals together or missed sparse fringing individuals altogether. And as a result of that, we found quite a bit of variability in the canopy area estimates generated by these methods. Finally, we also tested a couple other methods of analyzing orthomosaics, including automated aggregation tools in GIS, and also extrapolating DNR kayak-based transect survey data over the whole site. Again, there was a lot of variability between methods. We think there's a lot of promise to these methods, but clearly further refinement is needed. And I know I'm over time, so I'll just wrap up here. Overall, we think that the project demonstrated the strength of aerial imaging platforms for mapping kelp canopies, but there's a lot of work still to be done. We provided some recommendations to Northwest Straits as to how they might incorporate these in the future. And I would encourage everyone to check out our story map and report, which both were linked in the meeting agenda for more info. This was very surface level. There's a lot of detail in there. And the story map in particular, you can play with some of the imagery, which we think is pretty fun. So that's what I got.
Great. Thank you, Tyler. All right, and I will wrap up our updates with a quick update on our new initiative that we're pretty excited about. We'll see where it goes. The Kelp Forest and Eeelgrass Meadow Health and Conservation Initiative. So I'm going to throw some resources here in the chat that I would encourage everyone to go look at. But just as a reminder, I haven't met everyone yet. My name's Elizabeth Spalding. I am the new Marine Vegetation Implementation Strategy Lead, housed within the Habitat Strategic Initiative at Washington Department of Natural Resources. And I wanted to share some information about this Kelp Forest and Eeelgrass Meadow Health Conservation Initiative, which DNR recently submitted. So as I've said, I've got the link to the bill as well as the fact sheet in the chat. So I would encourage anyone who is interested in this to read that and reach out if they have any questions. If I can't answer them, I can connect you to someone who can. But House Bill 1661 was submitted by the Department of Natural Resources and is intended to move forward very specific recommendations identified in the Kelp Recovery and Conservation Plan, the Puget Sound Eeelgrass Recovery Strategy, and the Blue Ribbon Panel on Ocean Acidification from 2012. And so specifically, this initiative aims to develop a kelp forest and eelgrass meadow conservation plan that will endeavor to conserve and restore at least 10,000 acres of kelp forests and eelgrass meadows by 2040. So DNR proposes accomplishing this plan by leading a collaborative planning process that will assess and prioritize areas for coordinated conservation and restoration activities throughout Puget Sound, as well as the Washington coastline. And this will be based on historical and current distributions, as well as other key considerations. So funding associated with this bill will allow DNR to complete the analysis needed to develop success measures, as well as coordinate those actions to develop and implement the conservation plan. We're pretty excited about this potential opportunity. We do think that engagement and coordination with all of our kelp and eelgrass conservation partners in advancing this work will be absolutely critical to its success. So while it is very early on, we did want to bring this bill to your attention. And again, I would encourage anyone who's interested to read the bill and the fact sheet and reach out with any initial thoughts or ideas. We will absolutely keep this group updated on the outcome of the bill. We would also ask, just because we do want people to be aware of this, to share that fact sheet with anyone you think might be interested in the outcome. And again, we want to start those conversations early. So please reach out if you have any questions or concerns or want to know a little bit more about this. And we will just continue to monitor and track as it moves through the legislature. So with that, I would like to move us into our first presentation of the morning. And we are going to start with Robert Keel from the Seattle Aquarium. And Robert's going to speak about his hypothesis, why kelp is declining in Puget Sound, and what we can do to restore it. So Robert, if you are ready. Are you there, Robert?
Yes, do you hear me?
Oh, there you are. Okay, Bob, I see that I may be going by the wrong first name.
Well, you know, all Roberts are Bobs, but not all Bobs are Roberts. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. This is actually some investigation that I've been doing into this area of bull kelp in Puget Sound stemmed from work I was doing in California. I always had a passion with the marine environment. I've been in, on, and under it my entire life, interfacing with it in many different ways. Even my schooling and career choices have all aligned me with the ocean. I grew up in the Santa Barbara area, and so my familiarity with kelp started down there. And I've been the aquarium systems engineer for the last 35 years. And so as a systems engineer working with the aquarium, I have been deeply involved with habitats of many different kinds, and the design and maintaining and operating critical life support systems that enable these animals to survive in captivity. And I think that the easiest way to do this, and believe me, this was a very difficult thing to figure out how to present to you all, because I only have 10 minutes and you don't even know who I am. And so let me give you a little bit of background on what I was doing in California. And I trust, believe me, it will tie into how I've got involved with this issue with bull kelp in Puget Sound. So we all know about the altered states and the changes in the ecosystems that we've all observed. And the bull kelp issue up here is very similar to what we see around the world. And this, when it comes down to the restoration, which I will also be talking about, many of these restoration efforts are daunting, to say the least, in trying to figure out what variables we need to address. And with the countless variables that we encounter in the marine environment, those of you that are very familiar with it, which I know a lot of you are, understand the difficulties of this. And so just keep this in mind as I go through this presentation. Again, it'll touch a little bit on what I was doing in Goleta Bay, and then we'll transition into Puget Sound up here. This is the campus of UCSB right here at Goleta Point on the left. And what you see there is a sand-dwelling macrocystis kelp bed offshore. Those lines that you see going through it, the horizontal lines, those are from kelp cutters. Notice the date, this is back in 1972. The Santa Barbara Channel mainland coast had, it was almost a continuous band of kelp as you round point conception.
Bob, real
Yes.
quick, are you showing slides right now?
Yes.
Okay, we don't see those, so we might need to do a quick tech check.
You don't see them?
I'm getting, I don't see them. It looks like others are also not seeing them. So you might need to screen share, try screen sharing.
I did. I hit that. Escape. So I need to maybe minimize this and then go to screen share. Do you see
Looks
it
like
now?
it's thinking. Yep, we can see slides now. You might just want to pop it into presentation mode. There you go. Looks great.
Oh, good. Okay. So anyway, I gave it a brief introduction. This is actually a continuation of this introduction, but again, these altered states of the ecosystem and whatnot are what we're trying to adjust or address. So this image of Goleta Bay, like I said, this is where my original endeavors started with restoring kelp, because all of these beds along the Santa Barbara Channel mainland coast disappeared from storm energies associated with the 1982-83 El Nino. That was the largest in recorded history. I remember coming through the Gaviota Gap there on 101 in spring of 1983 and looking out. It's the first time you see the ocean in Southern California when you go southbound. And for the first time in my life, this nominally quarter-mile wide band of kelp was gone. And you can see that, like cartographers had marked and mapped the coasts here of Washington to some degree, they also labeled where the kelp forests were back in this case, 1882. When I showed you that picture inshore of Goleta Point there, Goleta Beach is right there where the pier is. And notice how wide the beach is. This is all factoring into the hydrodynamics of this body of water and the role that I believe the kelp bed played in the formation of these beach, that particular beach. Nominally 300 feet wide. Now, as a kid, I saw that beach wax and wane many times. King tides, swell events, sand would go out, would come back in, but it was self-sustaining, and that was the key. And inside the shoreline of UCSB here, you can see that it was so stable that grasses grew along the shore. There's a volleyball court and fire pit in the foreground. Along comes 1982-83 El Nino. That's a typical storm right there. And what you see down below is what it's essentially looked like ever since. Been no change. Back in 2003, Santa Barbara News Press, this article came up. And that was the grass that transitioned to that 300-foot wide sand that you see there on the left, which is now a 7-foot high bluff, and the water goes right up to it. And 50 feet of the park had been eroded back by the time this picture was taken. It continued on referencing report by Moffitt and Nickel engineers. And you can see on the right, the typical stuff, beach fill, breakwaters, jetties, groins, beach nourishment, all that stuff. It was my knowledge and understanding of this coastline that compelled me to write a white paper for discussion. It's centered around the role the kelp bed may have played in altering, in favoring the accretion of sediments along the shore. Nonetheless, they went through with armoring the shore, lots of fill, and you can see that even those two pictures down below, you can see in 3 days when I was down there, the amount of erosion cut back there was, and there was no wind or high or storm energies during that time at all. That was just typical tides. And so beach nourishment, and then it doesn't, you know, it's not going to hold. If you're addressing the symptoms but not the cause, it's not going to hold. And on the left, what you see are the sediments that they dumped on the beach. A lot of them had a lot of clays and stuff, and they used mean particle size as the criteria, but they were dredging these out of creek beds and stuff. And mean particle size, it doesn't really work when you have fine silts, clays, and large cobbles in there, and then the mean size is beach quality sand. You can see where it was put over beach quality sand, and then beach quality sand is trying to accrete back on top of it. This was an eroded cut that I saw at one time. The riprap extending across Goleta Bay is teeming with life. Has big fish, see a sheephead there, calico bass, and we don't see a decline. There was never an issue with the health of kelp in the region. Now, you talked about variability in the last slides. We see a lot of variability season to season, year to year with kelp forests anywhere around the world. But what's interesting is the riprap that covers the sewer line out across Goleta Bay is teeming with kelp, and it looks healthy. We don't see the same issues. When that kelp bed disappeared, the first thing I did was I made a dive sled. I could mount my camera to it, got towed behind a buddy's boat, and I filmed miles and miles of seafloor. And by the way, I have reports with lots of links where these videos are on YouTube and whatnot, where you can see footage of this stuff, and you can see how we went through the progression of this study along the way to document what was there, why was the kelp not recovering on the sand barrens. First thing I had to do was decide how much overburden did we have. So I got class 200 PVC pipe, pounded it in the seafloor, capped it, pulled out pores. And what you see here is a core of the typical seafloor that we found in a lot of places along the Santa Barbara Channel mainland coast. And you notice that about 14 and a half, 15 inches down, there's a shell layer. And the reason I'm showing this slide is because in trying to restore something like a sand-dwelling kelp bed, I realized early on that you have to work with the systems that are already in place, that Mother Nature already has in place. And in this case, with those shores along Santa Barbara Channel mainland coast, it's the diapatral worms and the worm tubes that are armored with shell fragments that the kelp spores settle on, develop into the gametophytes, the close proximity of which ensures in-water fertilization and the development of sporophytes. But there's nothing to hang on to there. So what I was conceiving at the time was, if we could put some small structure in there, something to get a foothold, to get kelp plants to the surface, would we see the sand-dwelling plants survive? I eventually wrote this first report here in 2010. And what you see in the middle there is a typical plant that we were seeing all over the beaches. Hold fast about the size of your hand, fronds less than 5 or 7 feet, and a remnant of worm tube in the middle. Up on the top, you see a typical diapatra. All those algae and kelps, those are all things that are either growing on or that the worm itself adhered for armoring of that. And you can see the kelp plant at the bottom. This is what it's trying to do. It's nothing to hang on to. Finally, convinced people, got a permit, 2015. That was huge. And then we went to work. Now we did see, like I showed you in that picture, a few kelp plants growing on sand bottom, but these would become dislodged or grazed. The bed has not recovered. None of these beds have recovered. And it's a huge mystery.
I just want to do a quick time check. We have a few minutes left for questions. So you might want to wrap up so we can take a question or two.
I have 10 minutes, right?
Yep, we're at 10 minutes now. So you've got a few more minutes for your presentation, and then we'll have time for a question or two.
Oh my. Okay. Oh boy. This is, okay, folks, here you go. I mean, let me get through this. Kelp crabs, big problem. We grew kelp. There's the riprap. We have currents. I was going to go into how the currents and whatnot affected stuff. The realization that on the plants that we were able to grow, we started finding juvenile 2-spot octopus. We decided to change the granite columns, add some chambers to keep them there. And once we kept the octopus in place, they now preyed on this primary grazer, the kelp crab. We also have sarcastic fringehead taking over some of these chambers. And once they do, octopus won't take up residence. So whole size, everything becomes critical. We're now seeing holdfast and plants starting to grow. We see lots of juvenile kelp bass and rockfish amongst the kelp plants. You can see the holdfast, how they're developing. Now we discovered a lot along the way. As these holdfasts start to develop, sand filters into the interstitial voids, becomes the primary anchor. The worm tubes are no longer the primary anchor, but this is how they survived out there. You can see what we've got going on. It's really quite amazing. This is the next step. We're using vitrified clay pipe, again, 100% natural material. And we are presently working with Tenera Environmental, and they are going to be doing a formalized scientific assessment of this and analysis. And they are partnering with Dr. Dan Reed from UCSB, Dr. Mike Foster from Moss Landing, emeritus from Moss Landing. They are trying to figure out the best design for these chambers and the layout and how to perform a scientific analysis that can best quantify how to utilize these devices. On a side note, when the holdfasts get this big, they become adequate, suitable refuge for octopus. Until they're of size, the octopus can only be very, very tiny. Otherwise, they succumb to predation. And we're using research support services. We're investigating ways to vibratory embed these in the seafloor from the surface. Because like the kelp, bull kelp problem here along Puget Sound, this is not an acres problem. This is a many miles of coastline problem. There was a good story behind that one. Anyway, here in Puget Sound, I've watched the bull kelp for many years. Every one of those little lines points to a kelp crab. This was right over the water triangle in front of the aquarium. I'm going to zip through a lot of these, but this one is important just because the composition of the shorelines up here, I believe, is at the heart of this issue. Primarily the cobbles. We don't see a lot of large rock in places like Edie's Landing, yes, and a few other isolated places in that critical depth zone of -5 to -25, but it's primarily cobble this size and smaller. And so the problem here is that well, let me go through. I went through that mixing, freshwater intrusion. This motion of the water column, and we see this from swells and whatnot, is the underlying factor why we probably don't see kelp in many shorelines of Puget Sound where you think it should grow. Long before we arrived here, thousands of years ago, energy forces from wind fetch and swells were already working to remove cobbles from these shorelines, cobbles that kelps were growing onto and being pulled towards shore. I'll go into some of this, but this, we just kind of made up this graphic that shows how a typical kelp plant growing at a particular tide can be lifted and moved in the direction of wave propagation. We see enough.
Just want to do a quick time check. We need to wrap up pretty quickly.
We see a lot of entanglement of bull kelp along the shoreline of Puget Sound, which is indicative of the substrate it's growing on is moving. The habitat shelf to the north of us, you see the bull kelp on the outside. I found multiple kelp plants pulled up onto it at high tide. Once these cobbles are moved to the intertidal zone, they are no longer out there to support future kelp growth. This is a typical bundle on the left, pulled up from the water triangle. And on the right, I pulled that up from Lincoln Park, which is another anomaly. And I was going to get into anomalies because this is at the heart of this issue. Why is kelp growing here but not there? Floating debris also gets underneath the kelp fronds and it exacerbates this problem of upward pulses when you have these shoreward propagating of movement of waves. We see this also with understory kelps moving towards shore, and that these rocks all have them on it. The tidal action in Puget Sound, I believe, is at the heart of this as well. The further we get down into the Salish Sea, the larger the tide swings. Bull kelp growing at all the different life stages as it's moving up through the water column is going to be at the surface, even at very, very low tides. When these pulses of swell come through, they move cobble. And we see this at the very lowest tides, and this is a -4 tide that we had, lowest in recorded history this summer. And you can see off of Alki here and again, Lincoln Park, that exposed these areas. To the north of Vashon Point, we're still seeing kelp. When we pull it up, you see larger rocks. Up at Edie's Landing, you see larger rocks. And this one in the front it just emphasizes how once a rock is pulled into the intertidal zone, because we're not on the open coast, we don't have the swell and energies to do so, this is where these rocks sit.
Okay, so we probably need to wrap. Any last comments, Bob?
The fact that kelp is growing on the waterfront, all the stressors that are identified are exacerbated to the nth degree along the waters along here. And this particular, the bull kelp you see along the right there, that is growing under the West Seattle Bridge. That image to the left. So you can see that in a protected zone where it's getting freshwater influence constantly moving off, yeah, we have bull kelp and almost 1 to 2 foot visibility most of the year. I was going to go into this. This is some kelp that drifted into the aquarium. It's been circulating outside of us for over a month and a half now. And it came in off the coast or off the straits. You can see the size of, we even had some macrocystis. We still have bull kelp. I was going to talk about some of the areas where they're slated for restoration, and they were probably.
So Bob, I need to interrupt. What I would say is you've got a lot of interest in this and we need to stop right now. And people can, a lot of people have a lot going on in the chat with follow-up discussions. So what I'd encourage everyone to do is, Bob's got a lot of great ideas here. Let's continue them on the chats and continue them with individual discussions with Bob. I'm sorry we have to limit this, but the purpose of this meeting is just to start the conversation so we can all continue them in smaller groups.
Okay, so we are going to encourage everyone to follow up again in the chat. Bob, I think you're going to have some good questions. I'm seeing folks say things like they'd really love to see the full presentation. So what we need to do now is move to our next presenter. I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Whitty with the Northwest Straits Commission, and he is going to talk about the Kelp Plan Implementation Phase 1, scoping for an inventory database on ongoing efforts and activities. So I am going to hand it to you, Jeff, and I will work on, do you need the screen?
Yes, please.
Okay, so you should be able to, Bob, can you try to, let's see.
I think I can kind of kick them off.
Yeah.
Sorry, Bob.
There you go, that looks good. So just pop that into presentation mode.
Yeah. You see that all right?
We can see it, yep, that looks great.
Perfect. All right, well, thank you all for having me here. As Elizabeth mentioned, my name is Jeff Whitty. I am the new project coordinator here at the Northwest Straits Commission. And at the commission, I have multiple projects that I'll be working on. One will be green crab monitoring and removal. And the other one that I'm also very excited to be a part of is this kelp plan, this Puget Sound kelp conservation recovery plan. And my role in this will be the project coordinator. And what I'm here to do, today to do is basically roughly give you an idea of what I will be doing in my position and where I'm at right now, but also providing a very brief description and have a very brief discussion on some of the ideas that have been floated by me in regards to how to move forward with the kelp plan. So the kelp plan, or as you all know it as the Puget Sound Kelp Conservation Recovery Plan, is kind of guided by 6 strategic goals, which each of themselves have their own actions. With these, they're not only guiding the kelp plan itself, but my position as well. And in a nutshell, very roughly what the idea of my position would be is to kind of continue and advance what you've all already started. You've all done this amazing job with communicating with each other and setting up work groups like this to help collaborate and move this forward. And it's going to be my job to continue that and advance it, to include other groups, to link the researchers with the managers and other stakeholders throughout the Puget Sound area as they are in regards to the kelp plan. In addition to this, I will be monitoring and reporting on the actions and goals of the kelp plan to all of you, as well as the managers, to make sure we're moving forward together and to identify any gaps that there might be in the actions and to help fill those gaps. Additionally, I'll be looking at working with groups outside of this kelp world and seeing if we can link the kelp plan with other recovery plans, such as with salmon or rockfish or abalone. Now, I do have to say, I am fairly new to this, and please be patient with me as I get my feet wet and immersed into everything kelp plan and discover, who's doing what in the Puget Sound area. I've already been fortunate to speak with a number of you, and I have a very long list of other people that I would like to contact, basically to better understand what all your projects are doing and how they might relate to the Kelp plan. And in the meetings I've had already, and in the workshops that I've watched from that you've had in the past year or so, there have been a few ideas of how my position and how all of you can help push forward the Kelp plan and get it implemented or continue to implement it. And a few of those ideas are listed here on the left side, one being a Kelp plan website. Now, I will have to say that a lot of these are going to be funding dependent, but they can be very powerful tools. The Kelp plan website not only can be a great tool for public outreach, but can be an amazing source for managers or legislators to come and learn all about Kelp and what all the actions are and what their status is. And not only that, but to link them to all of your websites to get further information. A quarterly newsletter, Kelp plan work groups like this one, and Kelp meetings, formation of an advisory board, which would be great for helping to prioritize the actions of the Kelp plan. And again, these are just a small list, and I will be contacting all of you to discuss these in further detail. What I do want to say, though, is I'm not here to reinvent the wheel. I know some of these already exist, like this work group, and I'm here just to make sure that they continue on and then add things in where it's needed. I also do not want to overburden you all with meetings and emails because you have a lot of very important information and jobs to do and collect. So again, I'm just happy to, or I look forward to meet with you all and discuss what a good happy medium is to effectively and efficiently move forward together on this Kelp plan. The one thing I do want to do today to kind of kickstart this is to discuss one of these ideas, and that is the construction of a project or effort inventory. You discussed this somewhat in your last meeting where it was brought up that you'd like to have an inventory for the subtitle monitoring effort. And I think that's an amazing idea. And I just want to take that and basically expand upon it to not only include monitoring effort, but each of all effort as they relate to each of the 6 goals in the Kelp plan. And so what I want to do today is very briefly with the next 5-10 minutes and at a very high level, discuss this idea. I want to ask you, would this be useful to you in your work and further in the Kelp plan? 2, what would you like to be included in this if you are interested in it? Would you like, it can be project names, their status, potential outcomes, funding sources, things like that. And would you like it split between the 6 different goals, which might be necessary just because they are fairly different? And also, what form would you like it to be in? Again, this is going to be funding dependent, and it probably would start off as something as simple as a Google Doc, but with funding and time, it could turn into something more advanced, like an online interactive database that could be sourced or live at the Kelp plan website. So with that, if you want to raise your hands or type something in the chat box, we can start off a discussion and it can grow from there.
Right, so I see a few hand claps in the emoticons. I think people are excited, Jeff. So feel free to, as I said, raise your hands and I'll help Jeff keep an eye on the crowd. Helen has her hand up. Helen?
Hi, everyone. One of the things I'm wondering about is who, many of us are researchers here, and there are some planners here too. Who do we want this database to talk to each other about the research we're doing? Or is the inventory, would it be more useful to deliver information up to managers and planners? And I don't know if Hugo might have some ideas on this. He's on the line. But so that's one of my big questions is, do we need this to talk to ourselves, or do we need this to talk to other people, or both?
And I'll chime in, and please, everybody else, feel free to raise your hand and chime in as well. I see this being something useful to everyone. Not only did the researchers bring this up in last meeting because they want to, figure out, I think it was Tom and Hilly were discussing this last time, figure out, who's involved to get a better idea of trends and distributions of kelp and what data is out there. But I also see it as a potential way for managers and legislators to keep track of what is actually going on, so things don't fall through the crack and they are more informed. But again, I'd love to hear other input from other people.
So I see one both in the chat. Please feel free to use your hands or enter your thoughts in the chat box.
Hi, Elizabeth. Hi, this is Hugo.
Hi.
I was trying to raise my hand, but it didn't work. So, Jeff, welcome to the kelp world. My name is Hugo Flores. I work with DNR, Washington DNR Aquatic Resources, and I'm glad that you are asking for feedback. One of the things that I think you need to work on is to get together with local governments, specifically to ask them how they are doing, what kind of policies and regulations they have to protect kelp and eelgrass. We have two main tools to do this. One is the Shoreline Master Program, which is the Shoreline Management Act. And the other one is the Growth Management Act. Those are the tools that we use to manage development, and specifically SMA for coastal development. So it would be very interesting to work with local governments and ask them if they have had any kind of assessment of how their policies and regulations are protecting kelp. And if not, work with them and ask them what kind of information they need. I think one of the biggest issues they have, the local entities, is that they want to know if we have any priorities, if we have identified specific sites that need to be protected. So I would say that would be something really important to do. And that takes a lot of coordination. And I'll be happy to work with you on that if you need help to do that. I could work with you and get this going.
Thank you, Hugo. And I definitely will take you up on your invitation to work with you. I've seen you speak in the previous meetings, and I'm always very keen to hear what you have to say, because it's very helpful and very informative, especially in relation to management. Management and basically getting management connected to researchers and informed of what's going on has definitely been something that a lot of people have been voicing, and is definitely on my radar, and very important. So we will be continuing with that. And again, I'll be contacting you very shortly. And so in regards to the priorities, that's also been something that's been very important to a lot of people. And we will be forming an advisory committee, likely of some local and potentially some international people as well, to nail down what priorities are, or what the priorities are for the various actions in the kelp plan. So great points.
Jeff, you're getting some feedback in the chat. I will make sure to capture that, but I will also just point you that direction. For the sake of time, I think we need to wrap up. So if others have questions or comments, please do send them in the chat. Jeff, anything else before we move on?
I'll say quickly, again, I will be contacting a lot of you, but please feel free to contact me if you'd like to set up a meeting to discuss things like this. And I'm sure we'll have some other, again, more meetings that are going to be a lot more in depth. I'll have more time to have these discussions. But thank you very much, and I'm very glad to be here and working with you all.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, so do continue. I see some good conversation going on in the chat. I will be capturing and saving all of that, pointing it toward the right people, but also including it in our summary. So we just want to remind you, please do continue to share your thoughts there. We are now going to shift gears a little bit and move into our transboundary connections phase of the meeting today. So we have a few presentations within that theme, and then we'll move into open discussion. So the first one, we are starting with Meadow Costa with the University of Victoria, and I apologize in advance if I mispronounced your name. And she will be talking about the British Columbia Kelp Resilience Project. So Meadow? And you're still muted.
I'm good now?
Yep,
Yeah,
sounds
you
great.
said that right, Elizabeth. Yes, my name is Maicira. I'm gonna start to share my screen right away, so we move forward. Where is it here? All right, can you guys see my screen?
We can.
Yeah, you're good? Yeah,
Looks
so,
good.
yep. And I guess you can hear me. So first, thank you very much. Thank you, Helen, for inviting to give a talk and show a little bit of the work that we're doing in British Columbia. But I guess the first thing to say is there's other people working with kelp in British Columbia as well, including with this idea of using remote sensing tools, right? And some of these people are here in this meeting, so I want to make sure that I acknowledge that. So this is the work that we're doing at the University of Victoria in the Spectral Lab, and is in collaboration with many people in BC who are in this talk as well, right? So generally we are calling this project the BCKelpR Resilience Project, and what we're trying to understand is the spatial temporal changes in kelp in the Salish Sea, in the BC coast in general, but as you'll see, we'll narrow down a little bit in the Salish Sea and the Haida Gwaii. Those are the areas that we're starting to work with. And we want to understand how these changes, why these changes are happening. So we're trying to compile data on local and regional environmental and biotic drivers as well. So it's kind of quite an ambitious project. We're moving forward with it, but there's a lot to be done. And hopefully it's something that we can merge with the Puget Sound group as well. So in a very broad way, the idea of looking at spatial temporal distribution of kelp in a large area such as the BC coast, even if we just talk about the Salish Sea or Haida Gwaii, they're extremely large. So the ultimate tool is using satellite platforms, but there are constraints of using that. So we can have data that is it represents kelp in the region. So the data that we're contemplating using, and depend on the area, it's more appropriate or not appropriate at all. It starts with the Landsat series in 1973, and these are all the satellites that we're using right now, including aerophotography, right? And this goes from the lower resolution, which is the Landsat, which is about 30 meters, to 10 meters, and depending which spot, 20 or 10 meters resolution, to very high spatial resolution, the meters like 1, 2, 3 meters, to sub-meter with aerophotography. Prior to that, prior to this time, the 70s, beginning of the 70s, we are compiling government surveys. It's not very organized. There are things everywhere. So we're trying to do our best to compile those surveys, which some of them happened during the 70s and the 80s. And prior to that, we're looking at some data that our lab has recently published on using of the British nautical charts, which express the presence of kelp along the BC coast. So I'll show some maps of that as well. And the goal is, for the satellite component, we try our best to validate the data that we're producing with any data that we find, any historical data, especially from government. In regard to the drivers data, we're compiling the general climate indices, the El Nino, North Pacific Gyro Oscillation, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and the local environmental and biotic data depending on the availability, right? So we have a lot of sea surface temperature for the time series of lighthouse data in the BC coast. We are processing all the Landsat sea surface temperature data now, and I'll show some examples of that from 84 to present. We have other data that are available from different models. And for a few areas, we have sea urchin and sea otter data. And we're trying to also acquire data or compile data available in terms of kelp harvest development and boat traffic in the region that we're going more in depth in the analysis. So in a very broad term, the approach that we're taking for the mapping of the kelp is an object-oriented approach. So Tyler talked about the random tree approach for mapping. We'll take a slightly different approach. So basically we get our image and we eliminate everything that we define that it should not have kelp, such as land, deep water, and soft substrate. And then after that, we digitally manipulate all the bands available for that specific image to highlight the areas with kelp. We define some indices from that. And after all of this is put together, we get everything good that we produce digitally about that specific region. And we feed to an object-oriented classification software called Ecognition. And this is just an example here showing Ecognition does not classify anything on a pixel base, but it clusters in regions first. That's the segmentation approach. And after that, a classify model is applied to the image. So in this case here, so those red areas are the true areas, or no, the yellow areas are the true areas with kelp, right? With this approach, we do a validation, and we have been very successful on this approach of using object-oriented instead of pixel-based approach. It does minimize a lot of errors in our area. But one of the first things that we have to do before all of this is done is select which images are more appropriate for the different regions because of the spatial resolution of the different satellites that we're using. So here's an example of an area in Haida where an image was acquired at very high spatial resolution, and we degraded the resolution to up to 30 meters. So it's easy for you to see that the information, as I move my cursor here, starts to get much more mixed when you're in 20 meters or 30 meters spatial resolution. And just as I highlighted, the kelp areas are those areas that I'm pointing out here, right? So much easier to see the kelp at very high spatial resolution, like 2 meters, 6 meters, even 10 meters. Now we're talking about Sentinel-2. But then at 20 meters and 30 meters, things may get a little bit complicated, especially if you're close to the near shore. So here are some examples of that in the Gulf Islands. So this is a classification here in red of image at 2 meters spatial resolution. So this is my kelp. When I degrade that image to 10 meters spatial resolution and I classify it using the same approach, the object-oriented approach, those are the areas that are classified as kelp at 6 meters spatial resolution. I should do this and this. So 2, 6, they're quite similar. 10 meters, you start to lose your kelp. And at 20 meters, you lose a lot of your kelp, right? So you're not being able to detect any of those very near shore fringe kelp anymore with a 20 meter spatial resolution. So you start to build guidelines. So if your kelps are very fringy near to the coast, narrow, you cannot really use a 20 meters resolution, neither a 30 meters resolution, because it's going to be inaccurate, right? So another example here is a large kelp area on a reef area away from the coast, right? I highlighted here in red. So they're greater than 20 meters wide. They are away from the coast. And with a 10 meters resolution, you can detect all the kelp here. You degrade that to 20 meters, you can still detect the kelp. And at 30 meters, you can detect the kelp as well. So easy to see that if you have a larger kelp bed away from the coast, you can actually use even a 30 meters Landsat spatial resolution. So with many trials on different areas, we define this guideline for us. So if you have a small nearshore kelp and or kelp close to reef areas, very narrow, you can only use 3 meters resolution is higher, which limited our time series right away to only high resolution satellites, starting with Iconos, WorldView, and so on, all the way to presently, for example, Planet. If you have large nearshore kelps, you can use even less than 6 meters resolution, right? So you're talking now about Rapid Eye, and then you have CompSat, Spot 6 and 7. So all of these satellites here will give you a resolution that it's about 6 meters or better, right, or higher. If you have large reefs, and they're not near shore. The kelps are not in the near shore, are slightly far from the shore, and they're wide. Pretty much you can use any of those platforms that we are contemplating using. So you have to be very critical which platform you need to use for each specific area. And this will definitely constrain your time series. Here's an example showing rapid eye at 6 meters in the Discovery Islands, very close to Victoria, right? So the areas that are with the red polygons are the ecognition classification of kelp, right? And what you see in the background is actually the kelp itself as expressed in the rapid eye image at 6 meters. So it does an excellent job on getting those, slightly larger kelp. If it's very close to the coast, then we don't trust our data too much at 6 meters resolution. So we do not use that data at all. So with that in mind, right? So now that we understand which satellite we can use for each area. So what I'm going to show to you is a couple of examples in the Salish Sea, specifically around Discovered Island and the Gulf Islands, and another test site in Haida Gwaii. And they all have different characteristics in regard to the kelp presence in this area. So I'll start with the Salish Sea. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, one of the first things that we did for the entire coast of BC was looking at those nautical charts. And I put here some snips showing how the kelp was expressed in these nautical charts that were, the chart that we used was from around 1850s to 1930s, something in this spectra. And we made a snapshot of those nautical charts, kelp distribution or kelp presence in the entire coast of British Columbia. That took about 137 British Admiral charts, and everything was auto-rectified and classified. So it was a lot of work, but we end up with this map that I'm showing to you here, where all the red areas are areas in which kelp was present at that period in the kind of mid-end of the 1800s, right? So I'm zooming in on this area here, and all this yellow are the kelp mapped with those historical charts, right? So a lot of kelp in this region at that time. So now we're going to try to understand what has happened more recent, right, in this region. And what you see in your right side here is a snapshot of that region, and the gray polygons are the maximum extent based on the entire time series of satellite image that we have analyzed so far, and there's many more to do. So there's not a complete time series. And what's in red is the year that are changing, right? So as I said, this is not a time-wise completely time series because we just received about 100 images from Digital Globe just before New Year that we're gonna be incorporating on this time series. So one approach that we took, instead of starting to look at drivers for this entire region, we decided that we're going to cluster this region in regard to some environmental factors. And we chose the factor that I'm listing here: tidal currents, fetch, sea surface temperature in the springtime derived by Landsat, sea surface temperature in the summertime derived by Landsat, and wind power, right? So these are my clusters based on those 5 different variables. So I have these areas here that are pretty much cluster 3 and 4. And as you move to the pink areas here, it's cluster 6. So there is a definition of the dynamic of this region. And I want to point out, just highlight a little bit what we did about this Landsat sea surface temperature. So this is the available ready products from Landsat. And what we did, we analyzed from 1984 to present the Landsat thermal infrared bands. And this is an example of a thermal infrared band after you process it. So it's expressed, we mask the land, this is the white, and you have here all the different gray levels, and they represent the temperature here. It's a bit small, but goes from about 11 degrees on the black to about 18, 19 degrees, the light gray. Right? So this is a temperature in a specific day on 2016. So what we did, we generated after that segments around basically a long polygon around the entire coast of the Salish Sea. And from that, we derive the average of the sea surface temperature on the entire region. So this is just before the heat wave this past year. This is on the 21st of June, 2021. And you can see here that we color coded the temperatures around these regions here reach about 25 degrees. So we had really warm sea surface temperature very close to the coast in this region. On the other hand, in this area here, right, the southern part, the Juan de Fuca channel is around here. So the temperatures continue to be relatively low, about 12, 8 degrees. So it didn't change too much compared to the norm, but those temperatures in the Gulf Islands did change a lot compared to the norm. And when we use the climatology of the Landsat sea surface temperature data, that's what we see. These areas are much more variable in regard to the temperature. They reach much more maximum temperatures, about 23, 24 degrees. On the other hand, these areas here, they do not change the temperature very often, right, from year to year. So this is allowing us to define those clusters very well defined, which is pretty cool. So within these clusters, you can see this area here is the area that has what this map is expressed, the largest kelp beds. And those are the areas that have the smaller kelp beds. So the area that have more variability in terms of temperature, but the tidal currents are lower, so they're not very dynamic. So what I'm gonna do now very fast is narrow down this area as a presentation of clusters 152, which has very narrow fringy small beds, high sea surface temperature, low wind, low fetch, low tidal current, according to my clusters. And this area here is slightly the opposites, lower sea surface temperature, high wind, fetch, and tidal current. So they define slightly different groups of environmental conditions, right? And I'll show to you very briefly what's happened. So the southern part, the ones with lower SST, high winds, and fetch. So we took a segment-based approach. So we divide the entire coast with segments, and that's why you see all those segments here. And in the red, you see the maximum extent between 2005 and 2020 for this specific region. So that could be a region that we can define as a sentinel area. So these areas have very large kelp, generally speaking. In 1850s,
I just want to do a quick time check. We need to wrap up so we can move to the next one, but then we can bring back everyone after.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll do in 2 seconds. Okay,
perfect.
So this area, what I'm showing here quickly is how kelp is varying from year to year within those segments, the percent variability, right? So I'm just going to go really fast on that. And then we define heat waves for this region based on the lighthouse data. And I'm not going to explain the method, but I will just finalize showing that for this specific area, these years that are missing here, we will filling up soon with the new digital globe data. But what we see is years were relatively warm, such as 2005, which had a slightly stronger El Nino, and here, which all know, very strong El Nino year. We have many days with higher temperatures. That's what this indices is indicating to me in terms of heat waves, and many days of high temperatures. And that's where we see relatively lower kelp in that specific region. It's not decisive because we need to fill up the gaps, and that's what we're doing right now. For the Gulf Islands, right, similar patterns is observed. So again, this is the total kelp, and we see that years such as this year here, kelp decrease. We don't see too much the same pattern in the 2005s, so, right? But there was at that time many days with high water temperatures, but we don't see a very much decrease on kelp. So either area is showing a different story, and that's the complication here. And for Haida Gwaii, one of the things that we see, which is quite interesting, is the disappearance of kelp, right? So this is one area in Haida Gwaii in which we have mapped kelp continuously in many years. And what happened was we noted that this region here, didn't have kelp for a while. And we went back in time and found this kelp bed in 1973 from the original Landsat data, which coincides with First Nations knowledge of the area and the nautical charge, the British Nautical Charge Archive. So we're trying to investigate what was the cause of the loss of kelp, which is a very big area in Haida Gwaii. And with that, I'll stop here. So it was a bit fast at the end, so sorry about that. So if you have questions, you can please contact me or let me know. So this is a moving on project. We are waiting for some grants announcement, hopefully by the end of this month. But in the meanwhile, we've been working very hard with our collaborators and our grads and postdoc students involved. And we're starting work with the Bati and the First Nations in the Broughton Archipelago, as well as a new pilot area for this study. And I'll say thank you. And I just want to make sure that you guys know I can put the contact again in the chat. We have an open position for postdocs. It's a UVic Hakai position on hyperspectral remote sense of kelp conditions. So I would love to, if you can spread this around, or if you have any candidates in mind, you can tell me. I would very much appreciate. That would be it. Thank you,
Right.
Elizabeth. And I'm
Thank
sorry
you.
about that.
Oh, you are fine. Yep. We got a lot of great information, and we can circle back. If anyone has questions, we do have some time at the very end to have some discussions. So you can enter them in the chat, or we can come back around after our last presentation. So with that, we are going to move into our last presentation. It's a full team. We have Rebecca Martone, Margot Hessing-Lewis, Olivia Rhodes, Catherine Sheps, Luba Reshitnik, and I guarantee you I did not say that right. And they're going to speak on the UN Decade of Ocean Science proposal and cross-border working groups. So I will hand it, Rebecca, I see you sharing your screen already. I will let you kind of kick it off with your team.
Excellent. Thanks so much. One sec, I'll get that back up again. I think I accidentally closed it there. I wanted to make sure it was on the right screen, and I think I am.
Yep, looks great.
Great. So thanks so much, everyone. I'm Rebecca Martone. I'm currently the executive director for a nascent center from underneath the Ocean Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development that we're starting up here in BC. It's being led by the Tula Foundation, which is also the parent organization for the Hakai Institute. So I'm going to give a little overview of what is the Ocean Decade, and then I'm going to pass it over to Margot Hessing-Lewis to talk about a specific project that we want to bring to your attention and hopefully start engaging in some transboundary collaboration. So in 2018, for those of you that aren't aware, the UN through UNESCO designated the decade of 2021 to 2030 as the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, with the aim to boost international coordination and cooperation in research and scientific programs to better manage our oceans and coasts. So the vision is really ocean science that's fit for purpose, this idea of like the science we need for the ocean we want. And I should say that science is quite broadly defined under the Ocean Decade. It's the physical and natural sciences, but also social science, as well as indigenous and local knowledge. So it's really knowledge-based, but they do use the terminology science. So just to clarify that. And the mission is transformative ocean science solutions to catalyze those for sustainable development to connect people in our ocean. And within that, there's a lot of different aspects. It's quite a large global undertaking, but it's really about mobilizing scientists, synthesizing existing research and identifying key gaps, co-designing new research with stakeholders, and really about bridging that science policy gap and engaging people to better connect with the oceans. So they've developed a framework, and I'm going to walk through it because I think it helps people kind of orient what is it that the Ocean Decade is aiming to do. So it's really a voluntary effort. There is no funding associated right now, specifically with the decade, but the idea is that it will catalyze work that can be amplified and attract funding to it. And there will be some funding organizations that are kind of try to mobilize funding for some projects that are engaged in the Ocean Decade. So to catalyze transformative ocean science, it means we want to move from the ocean we have to the ocean we want. And the ocean we want is defined by these decade outcomes you see here on the right. So that is a clean ocean, a healthy and resilient ocean, a productive ocean, a predicted ocean, a safe ocean, an accessible ocean, and an inspiring and engaging ocean. But to get there, one of the ways that the Ocean Decade has framed this is through these decade challenges. So we need to tackle these challenges to be able to get to these outcomes. And these include things like understanding and beating marine pollution, protecting and restoring ecosystems and biodiversity, expanding the global ocean observing system, etc. So this means to tackle those challenges, we need to kind of follow this, what they call the knowledge to action framing. So it's this idea of we need to start identifying what do we need to know, what is the knowledge we need to tackle those challenges, to generate that knowledge, and then to increase the use of it. And so there's a lot of emphasis on this full cycle and the iterative nature of the work we do in this space. And many of you already work in this space, but it's something that's meant to inspire this. And it requires collaboration and co-design, keeping in mind a variety of aspects of transformative science that I mentioned before. So the actions associated with the decade, following this framework, are through what they're calling programs, projects, activities, and contributions. So this is the way that people are starting to engage in the Ocean Decade. So the Ocean Decade International Oceanographic Commission has a decade coordination unit, and they have an advisory board. And so they have every 6 months a call to action where they're looking for decade programs, which are global or regional in scale, contribute to one or more of those Ocean Decade challenges that tend to be long-term and quite broad. But they are also looking for decade projects that then link to those programs. How do you actually implement these large global programs is at a regional or local level. And so it does tend to be more focused undertakings. They typically, again, contribute to Ocean Decade programs, although there are some projects that are endorsed by the UN as activities or as these decade actions that don't have program homes. And one is the Marine Plan Partnership here in BC. I just wanted to highlight that. In addition, they are looking for decade activities that tend to be events or workshops or training opportunities. And then finally, there are these decade contributions where people can provide funding or in-kind contributions to support the implementation of the decade. So to kind of highlight what does that actually mean here in BC and to kind of set up Margot for her talk, one of those global programs is the Marine Life 2030 program, which is run by NOAA's MBON, the Marine Biodiversity Observing Network, and the Smithsonian Institution. It's a global integrated marine biodiversity information management and forecasting system. It's quite wordy, isn't it? For sustainable development and conservation. So really this is about bringing together scientists to set standards for monitoring biodiversity and essential ocean variables, to then create monitoring systems that can inform management and policy and conservation action. So this again is a global program, and they're looking for projects that link to the program broadly, and one that is currently being developed right now with leadership from the Hakai Institute and others who are on this call is we're calling the Northeast Pacific Coastal Biodiversity Action Network. And the idea is to create and test a framework for cross-boundary actions to integrate and leverage biodiversity science for conservation, with a focus on the Salish Sea, but more broadly out into the Northeast Pacific. And it's meant to establish a network of ocean practitioners that are centered on major biodiversity themes, and also work through that idea of setting standards and ultimately creating biodiversity science that can inform conservation and policy. And I'll let Margot speak to that in more detail. In addition to this idea of global programs, there's often an interest in coordinating and cross-pollinating with other global programs. So some that come to mind that this particular project and this particular program are interested in are things like the Ocean Biomolecular Observing Network called OBON, which is a partnership for observing the global ocean using molecular techniques. And a lot of the work that's under Marine Life 2030 is also looking to use those types of technologies. So there's a lot of cross-pollination there. And there are other global programs like the Early Career Ocean Professionals Decade Program to bring to your attention that's meant to foster collaborations and secure positions for early career ocean professionals and give them opportunities to engage in these types of global and regional projects. So I just quickly also wanted to introduce this idea of the Ocean Decade Collaborative Center. So that's the work that I'm leading here in British Columbia. It's actually the Ocean Decade Collaborative Center for the Northeast Pacific. So our area of interest is here from Alaska through Baja, and probably will also include Hawaii to some degree. And our task is to make the Ocean Decade a success in the Northeast Pacific and to try to encourage and catalyze projects that cross this region, or at least touch aspects of this collaborative transboundary scientific work. And so our role is to identify knowledge gaps and support collaboration and exchange to tackle those Ocean Decade challenges. We're meant to support great proposals from the region, so we're really excited that the Hakai Institute and others are bringing this one forward. We're trying to help support the programs like Marine Life 2030. We're also, once projects and programs get endorsed, we are meant to help make them successful, help to coordinate them with other decade actions, and to help amplify them. Other aspects of what we do is to monitor and evaluate, but also to build broad public awareness. And so we have a huge support team here through Tula's Hakai Magazine and Hakai Media team. So it's another way that we're providing in-kind resources to support the Ocean Decade is through strong communication opportunities. And then ultimately, we're also meant to help mobilize resources to help match prospective financial donors with endorsed projects that need funding. So what is the benefit of participating in the Ocean Decades? I think this is an important aspect of what we are trying to get the word out. It's not necessarily funding, although it can lead to funding. But what this does is it serves as an umbrella and strengthens opportunity for international and multi-stakeholder collaboration. It's not necessary. As you know, you as a group are doing amazing work, and it's really inspiring to see all the great work coming out of Puget Sound and aspects of British Columbia's work on kelp. And it also brings formal recognition to these types of efforts. And again, helps to amplify that work and make it attractive to funders. It also leverages global and regional networks and those communication channels to get those to help amplify this kind of work. And I think ultimately, it's about addressing global challenges and creating solutions in the face of rapid change, which we all very much care about. So I just wanted to also encourage you to sign up for the Ocean Decade. It doesn't take much time, it doesn't cost much, but it gives you an opportunity to understand what the Ocean Decade's about and how you might get involved in different aspects of the Ocean Decade. And that's through this website, oceandecade.org. So now I'm going to hand it over to Margot to specifically dive into the details of this project that I think is relevant for this particular group. Margot, do you want me to just continue to?
That would be great,
Becca.
Becca.
Slides forward? Okay, great.
Yes, please. So as Becca mentioned, we're in the process of putting together a proposal that would fit under this Global Marine Life 2030 project. And this is really focused on augmenting some of the transboundary partnerships that currently exist or that we're interested in moving forward on in the future. So some of those, I think, for Kelp are coming forward through discussions like this. There's a lot of BC people attending this meeting, and we have been hosting similar meetings in BC, and there's reciprocity there in terms of inviting speakers from the States to talk to BC. It's also meant to support some of the conversations that often happen through larger proposal initiatives through the government or through the Salish Sea Ecosystem Conference. So we're looking at a framework to really build those transboundary partnerships in a meaningful way and do that across the tree of life. And as Becca mentioned, the work is really grounded in some of the UN Decades motives to link knowledge to really action-oriented pieces, and lots of those action policy, education, collaborative research pieces are also the focus of the discussions we've been having through our BC and Washington working groups. Okay, next slide. So we've put together a framework as a start. And we think that the kelp research community, both research and action-oriented community, is a really good place to start to kind of evolve some of this framework for talking, communicating, and implementing actions with one another. And so just really Basically, one idea is to have an overarching synthesis hub that draws information from across diverse taxa and systems together. And it would be organized along this idea of some of the foundational biodiversity building blocks, some of those really important discussions around essential ocean variables, sharing methodologies, working on data standards, and then linking that to biodiversity science, both analyses at larger spatial scales and investigate transboundary questions, as well as implementing some of that science. So through training programs, through education, through collaborative research projects, and then linking those up in kind of a cyclic way to some of the conservation and restoration actions. So within this framework, we'd have the synthesis hub and organizational and administrative support through that, through HACI, the Tula Collaborative Center that Becca discussed, and through other interested partners. And we're interested in hearing about groups that are interested in that side of things. Within that, there would be nodes that are specific to different taxonomies. And so, for example, Kelp would be a great node to focus in on. And within that, we'd be interested in this idea which Jeff put forward today. And Jeff, I think this is great that we're talking at the same time. We obviously need a quick follow-up with you because I think the work that you're doing would be super important going forward to figure out some specific working groups that we could lead and advance some of these discussions, collaborations along these different themes. So next slide, Becca. So if we kind of decompose this and look again at what the Kelp node may look like, some of the conversations that we've had today likely fit nicely into some of these building block themes. So Mysira's discussion about the work that her lab and collaborators are doing in BC, there's a lot of interest, I think, in expanding some of those concepts and potentially having discussions at a larger spatial scale. And then similarly, we heard about some of the restoration from Bob that is happening in Puget Sound and setting up some groups specifically to talk about restoration successes and processes happening north and south of the border. And then, we heard a lot from Jeff too, also about this kind of idea of a gap analysis. And we'd love to have a discussion about whether or not we could find, people that are also interested in doing similar work north of the border in British Columbia, and being able to put forward reports that build and leverage work that's been done in Puget Sound to have a broader sense of what's happening for the broader area. So we're just at the initial stages right now of reaching out. Becca, could you go to the next slide, please? We're looking at people's general level of enthusiasm. So this is a bit of a call out, like Jeff put forward as well. So it's well placed, I think, for today, as well as leadership for some of these working groups and conversations that arise through that. So we've also put together a Google Doc. If you could click right now and see if you can access the link there. We have a straw dog of some initial themes. And at this stage, we are looking for just generally people to sign up in that participant column that Becca's pointing at right now. If you're interested in any of these working groups, this is not a commitment to participate in any of these. We're going to have a follow-up discussion and likely a workshop to co-produce ideas, objectives, timelines for these in more detail. But we do want a sense of general interest in these different themes. And if you scroll down to the bottom, there's an area where we'd love people to add additional ideas. If you have people you know of that aren't at the meeting today, you can also suggest them and we can do some follow-up work with that. There's also another tab for emails, and hopefully we'll be able to combine forces with this group and the work that Northwest Strait is doing to see about sharing some of the contacts. So the next step following this after we see if there's interest in moving forward in this, would be to develop a workshop and think about these ideas of developing some more work-based groups in more detail. And to do that, we would work really closely with the group in British Columbia as well. We have a group, the BCKelp Analytical Working Group, that we've been working on with my CIRS group and MAP for the last couple of years. And we've already done a similar exercise of interest up in BC. So we'd like to combine with that group and look forward to working together in the future. And if you have any specific questions or are really interested in playing a leadership role, we're definitely looking for people that have the bandwidth to do that, because I know everyone's tight on bandwidth these days. If you can get in touch with me and that'll connect to the rest of the HackEye team, that would be great. And I'll open it up in case I've missed something the rest of the HackEye team would like to chime in about.
Okay, that is a perfect segue though, Margot. I think, this discussion that we want to have with everyone now is really what are those additional opportunities, transboundary collaborations, connections we want to make. And Helen, if there's anything else about that discussion you're hoping to get from, please feel free to kind of fill in the details. But we did want to open it up for questions to either of our transboundary connection presentations, and then just have a little bit of time for dialogue around those opportunities before closing out. So feel free to, you can ask questions in the chat. We can also just use our hands now. I can see everyone's raised hands if you'd like to use that button to make a comment. Helen?
Hi, I'd just like to really thank Margot and Becca for jumping on the UN Decade work. I've got to say that I'm daunted by trying to think about the scale that they're working at. And so I'm really excited and just like a deer in the headlights about it. So I just want to express that. It's really exciting, and I'm really glad that, that they're tackling it. And I know that many of us really want to take part.
Thanks, Helen. And I mean, I see that these kinds of initiatives as the way that's going to happen, right? It has to be done in chunks. It has to be done with focused objectives and outcomes. And, Margot's presentation provides that kind of framework. But I think ultimately when people come together, the reality is you have to kind of prioritize. And that's something that I think collaboratively we can do. And then, that doesn't preclude people from taking their own work forward. But I think collectively where we can see where we can make the biggest change and make the biggest difference, I think that's where the Ocean Decade can really leverage all the amazing stuff that's going on. But yes, it is daunting. I'm looking for help. So I'm excited to see lots of great work going on in this region.
And Ron, you have your hand up?
Yeah, this is great. Thank you very much. Net ecological gain is in my brain now. And, the coasts, and relative to kelp and eelgrass, for example, the idea of, this coastline is developed, it's going to develop more. How can we do it and end up with better and more kelp and eelgrass? I mean, I think that's a challenge. There's going to be more people. They're going to be wanting to move to the coast, and there's stressors associated with it. How can we end up not losing more and actually gain some kelp and eelgrass in the process? I think that's a challenge, and I don't have any real answers to it, other than trying to reduce stressors somehow, and consider the needs of kelp in terms of the light and the nutrients and the substrata, and how to make that be sustained.
Thanks, Ron. I just wanted to chime in there that's really great to hear. And we've kind of been inspired by the kelp recovery and conservation plan that has been put together in Puget Sound. And maybe that's one of the kind of overarching pieces that we can use to bring all of the information together and really kind of chart out a course for what a net gain strategy would look like in the real world.
Other questions or comments? Helen?
So I guess my perspective, and I suspect the perspective of many of the people on this call, is we want to get involved, we want to help. If we sign up on the Google Doc, is that the best next small step for those of us who are having trouble getting our brains around the entirety of the project? Is that the just so we know what baby step to take?
Yes, the baby step would be to add your name to the Google Doc. If you could pass on your email, that would also be great. But Helen and Elizabeth and Jeff, we can be in touch about sharing email contacts as well for broader dissemination through these forums. And we want to have some specific conversations with people in Washington State that we haven't talked with yet. So along the lines of Jeff getting in contact with people, we would love to first talk with Jeff and then get in touch with other people. And then the next step that we're going for is organizing a workshop to go into some more detail about where people would like to go with some of this work and where we can collaborate on that. And we'll be in touch about that.
Good news is we have a decade, which helps. That's how I sleep at night. I have a whole decade. It's good.
And the other good news is that there is a lot of momentum behind Kelp. There's a lot of people engaged in doing this work. And so Kelp, I think, is actually kind of a showcase of how this might happen. Some of the other groups are going to be maybe a little bit more diffuse and even more difficult to kind of bring together in a cohesive framework. So we want to start with Kelp and really give that a go and see where we can go.
Ron, is that a new hand or an old hand?
I'm sorry, it's
No.
old,
Okay, that is fine.
very old.
Any other comments or questions? We have a few more minutes left for open discussion.
Maybe just briefly, I think one partner to highlight for this project writ large is the Salish Sea Institute. So they've signed, I think they're likely to be signing on as partners. And they're really with that idea of the transboundary work and that connectivity between British Columbia and Washington. I think they're a really important partner. And I think there is, as Margot said, there's an opportunity for partners at different levels. And so there's sort of the overarching level versus just wanting to engage through Kelp, or if they're Kelp and Eeelgrass or whatever. So I think keeping that in mind, and you don't have to sign up right away, just saying I'm interested in staying engaged is, is also a way to just make sure you don't lose the thread.
And I might add, don't be too daunted just by the idea of kind of talking about it. If you were kind of daunted by the diagrams or kind of these broader themes, if we start with Kelp and at least get a cross regional discussion going with, working in Washington and BC. I know a lot of these questions are just things we're already trying to do, and it would be nice to talk about how we can coordinate those efforts and not necessarily establishing new efforts, but just keeping an open discussion. Because there's similar meetings that I attend in California right now, and also in Oregon, and everybody's talking about these things, and it would be great to have at least some discussion going where people are talking across regions, since there's so many intersecting points. So thanks for having us also. We really appreciate it.
Helen, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up one other issue as someone who's incredibly excited but doesn't know quite what to do next, which is that it seems like we have some really special connections within the Salish Sea, so that You know, when I look at Washington, I do want to be up to date with what they're doing in Oregon and California, but I feel like the Washington, BC connection is by far the most profound because we have similar Salish Sea issues, which is a completely different environment than the outer coast. And then we have an amazing outer coast on both in both the province and the state. So I don't know how we can explore those different geographic regions and the challenges to them. But I definitely, as part of this larger umbrella of really building our connections with BC Research and Management, wanting to look specifically within the Salish Sea, because the issues that Mysera, you know, I look at Mysera's slides and I think, oh, that's so similar to what's happening in Puget Sound. And so it seems like there's a particular nexus for connection there, given the physical environment, the biological environment, and the human environment. So I don't know how we fit that under the umbrella too, but I hope we can.
I think that's right, Helen. And when we originally conceived of this project, I think the idea was to focus on the Salish Sea because of all the things you said. And I think we can use it as this test case in a way and say what you learn here can then be exported elsewhere. All that to say, where there is that connection across these broader groups, I don't think we want to lose that thread. So it may be that it's just nested to some degree. And we just sort of have to, I guess, consider that some parts will be broad and other aspects will be really focused on the Salish Sea. At least that's one way forward. And I think these are some of the issues that we can bring forward, you know, at an initial workshop to really frame this. And maybe it's, you know, for the first 3 years, it's focused on X, Y, and Z, and then it expands from there.
Hugo, I noticed you're playing with your emoticons and your camera's on. Do you have a...
Yes. Thank you, Elizabeth. Sorry again. Yes, this is really exciting, actually. It's very exciting, this conversation. Ron mentioned that one of the biggest challenges that we have is development. We will have more people along the coast, and that is something that we need to, as planners, we need to be ahead of the curve. And it's something that is similar for the BC and the Puget Sound region, the Salish Sea. In Washington, we're expecting about 9-point-something million people in the next 40 years. I'm pretty sure BC will be the same. So the question is, how can we have, like Ron said, kelp and development? So the battle is going to be at the local site, at the local level. We need to give tools to planners. We need to create some kind of a tools for them so they can see that the next planning has to take in consideration what's going on in the uplands. It will have an input in the aquatic, the marine areas. So I think that's one of the immediate challenges that we have, both BC and Washington. So hopefully, we could make those connections. And also, you know, in Washington State, we have also issues with the federal government. We have the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. So those are different avenues that we could also explore and make those connections.
Okay, we just have a few more minutes left, and I have a couple of announcements at the very end, very quick ones about our reading materials. Any last comments or questions before we adjourn? Okay, I will keep the chat open for a few minutes once we are done. There's been some great conversation here at the end of the meeting in that chat. So if you want to take a minute or two just to skim that, but we will copy everything and take what's relevant and include that in the meeting summary. So there will be a record of this. We'll both send or post the recording of this on YouTube so that if you want to rewatch any of these presentations or send those who might be interested in those presentations to them, we'll have that hopefully by end of week, Monday at the latest. We will also take all of our feedback from the discussion as well as the chat and compile it into a summary so we can keep tabs of what that conversation looked like. And then the next meeting will be May 11th. same time, same place here at Zoom from 10 to noon. We will send out an agenda prior to that, but we want to remind everyone that this is really meant to be a service for you all. So please do feel free to share with us ideas for presentations or discussions that you would like to have. You can enter that through the chat. Again, I'll keep it open. Or if you'd like, you can email Helen directly and we can work with you to integrate that into our next agenda. So, kind of think about where you want to take these conversations. We are really here to help connect you all. And there will be quite a bit of follow-up, it looks like, from this meeting. So in particular, it sounds like folks will be interested in reviewing this Google document and understanding more how they might plug into this UN project. Jeff Whitty will be reaching out and having some conversations with regard to our compendium of projects. And if anyone wants to talk about the marine vegetation implementation strategy and or the kelp conservation plan bill, please do reach out to me. And with that, Helen, anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up? Okay, well, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. I will say thanks, everyone, for giving us 2 hours of your time. We really appreciate it, and we're so glad you're here.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. It's great to meet you.
Helen, while I still see that you're here, can you take that chat that you saved and send it, like put it in a Word doc and just send it over to me so I can add it to mine? You're muted.
I already sent you the text document
Oh,
right after
perfect.
you got pop text on. So, and I just did another save, so let me know. when
Okay,
you-
I've got this saved. Let me check my email quickly.
Yeah.
That's why we always have a co-host.
Yeah, that was, you got lost, huh? You disappeared. I saw it. You were gone.
Yep.
And then I got nervous and then you appeared again. It was great.
Yep, I was completely kicked out. Okay, that looks perfect. I'll add that to my list. Okay, I will, oh, one last request. I've lost the password to our YouTube account. So if you could send that to me, I'll timestamp the video and upload it. And that's not,
cool.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
I'll see you later today.
Yeah.